The number on the lease agreement was wrong, and Nora knew it before she even finished reading the first paragraph. She'd been doing other people's numbers her whole life. Grocery receipts for her mother when she was 9. Tax forms for neighbors who didn't trust the mail-in instructions. The books for her uncle's restaurant until the night she found the second set of ledgers and understood, finally, why he'd always paid her in cash and told her to keep quiet about it. Numbers didn't lie. People did. But numbers just sat there on the page and waited for someone patient enough to look. The lease agreement had a discrepancy of $47,000 buried in the amortization schedule. Someone had rounded incorrectly in the 4th column, or had chosen to round incorrectly, which was a different thing entirely. Nora circled it with her pen, a red ballpoint she'd been using since Tuesday, the cap long gone, the ink starting to run thin, and set it on top of the stack. The stack was the reason she was still in this building at 11:45 on a Friday night. She worked for Kellerman and Associates, which was a name that sounded like a law firm and functioned like one in certain ways, but was technically a financial consultancy that did due diligence for commercial real estate acquisitions. Nora was not an associate. She was not even close to being an associate. She was a junior analyst, which meant she was the person who sat in an empty conference room on the 42nd floor and checked the numbers that the associates were supposed to have checked already, but hadn't, because they were at dinner or at the theater or doing whatever it was people did in this city when they made 3 times what Nora made. She didn't mind the empty building. She'd grown up in apartments where there was always noise, always someone's television through the wall, always a baby crying 2 floors up at 2 in the morning. Silence was a luxury she'd learned to appreciate. What she minded was the door. It opened at 11:51, and the men who walked through it were not building security. There were 3 of them. The first 2 she classified immediately as function rather than personality, large, quiet, positioned at angles that suggested they'd done this before, entering rooms and making exits feel hypothetical. The 3rd man walked between them, though not in a way that suggested they were escorting him. It was more that they had arranged themselves around him the way water arranges itself around a stone, not because the stone asks for it, but because that's simply what gravity requires. He was taller than she'd expected, though she hadn't expected anyone. He wore a suit that was the color of something between charcoal and navy, and his face was the face of a man who had decided some years ago that expressions were a resource to be conserved. There was a scar along the left side of his jaw, thin and old, silver against the darker skin. His hair was going gray at the temples. He looked like he was somewhere between 40 and the kind of tired that doesn't correspond to age. He looked at her the way people look at something they weren't supposed to find. "The building is supposed to be empty," he said, not to her, to one of the large, quiet men. "She's building staff," the man said. "Lee's records show she signed in at 7:42. "I'm not building staff," Nora said. "I'm a subcontractor for Kellerman. I'm doing due diligence on the Marchetti acquisition." The 3rd man, the one who was not function, who was something else entirely, turned back to her. His eyes were dark and very still. "What's your name?" "Nora Callahan. What did you find?" She looked at him. "I don't know who you are." "No," he said. "You don't." He walked to the table, picked up the top document from the stack, the lease agreement, and looked at the red circle without any change in his expression. 47,000, he said, "and change." He set the document down. "Mrs. Callahan, my name is Vance." He said it the way people say surnames that are also titles, not introducing himself so much as placing a word in the room for her to do something with. "I own this building. I also own the company that is acquiring the Marchetti portfolio, though that connection is several layers removed from anything Kellerman was told, which means you're sitting in my building at midnight, reading documents that outline a transaction I've spent 4 months arranging, and you've found something in 47 minutes that my legal team missed in 4 months. Nora didn't say anything. "That's either impressive or inconvenient," Vance said, "possibly both. The amortization schedule has a computational error in column 4. It's not subtle if you know what you're looking for. Your legal team was probably looking for the wrong things. And what were you looking for? Whatever's there. He studied her. Not the way men sometimes studied her, looking for something to use. The way she looked at ledgers. Methodically, like he was doing math. How long have you worked for Kellerman? 11 months. Before that, H&R Block. Before that, a restaurant in Queens. Before that, 2 years of night classes at City College and a full-time job at a dry cleaner that paid me under the table and shorted my hours. She paused. Is this an interview? I don't know yet, Vance said. It might be. She closed the folder in front of her and stood up. She was not tall. She was the kind of woman who had learned to take up exactly as much space as she needed, which in most of the rooms she occupied was very little. Mr. Vance, I have 3 more folders to get through tonight. If you need me to stop, I'll need that in writing from Kellerman, with a contact name and a reason. Otherwise, I'm going to keep working. One of the large, quiet men made a small movement. Vance held up one hand, very slightly, and the movement stopped. Finish your work, he said. He sat down across the table from her. She opened the next folder. He didn't speak again for 40 minutes. Neither did she. She worked through the second and third folders and found 2 more discrepancies, smaller ones, one of them arguably a rounding convention rather than an error, though she noted it anyway. The quiet men stood by the door. Vance sat with his hands folded on the table and watched her in a way that should have been unnerving and was instead simply present, like weather. At 12:47 she put her pen down. 3 issues, she said. The 47 in the lease amortization, a possible misclassification of a capital improvement as an operating expense in the Kellerman summary. That one might be intentional. It reads like someone made a choice, and an inconsistency in the rent roll for the commercial units on floors 2 through 8. The vacancy rates don't match the income projections by about 6%. Vance looked at her. The rent roll? Yes, my team had the rent roll reviewed twice. I know. I can see their annotations. She turned the folder toward him and pointed to a column near the bottom of the 3rd page. They were checking whether the numbers added correctly. They do, but the inputs are wrong. Someone changed the vacancy assumption after the income projection was run. The projection wasn't updated to match. He looked at the column. He looked at it for a long time. If this deal closes with these numbers, she said, you're overpaying by somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million, depending on how you weight the amortization error. And if it doesn't close, he said, not to her, more to the air in front of him, the seller walks to the other offer. Nora didn't respond to that. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't her business. Ms. Callahan. He leaned back in his chair very slightly. It was the first time he'd moved in 40 minutes. What does Kellerman pay you? That's not information I'm inclined to share. I'll pay you 3 times it. She looked at him. For what? To do what you just did. Find what's there. She picked up her pen. I have a job. You have a job that sends you to empty buildings at midnight to fix work that should have been done by people who are paid significantly more than you and went home hours ago. He said it without any particular emphasis. Like a number on a page. I'm offering you a contract, 6 months. Your only responsibility is to look at whatever I put in front of you and tell me what you find. Nora was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, 42 floors below, the city was doing what the city always did, indifferent and enormous and lit up in a way that had once seemed magical to her and now mostly seemed like a lot of electricity. What kind of business are you in, Mr. Vance? He looked at her. Several kinds. The kind that has 2 men standing by the door at midnight. He didn't answer right away. Then the kind where the numbers have to be right, where being wrong is not an administrative inconvenience. He paused. The kind where I need someone who looks for what's there. She understood what he wasn't saying. She'd understood it for the last hour, actually, in the way she'd understood the second set of ledgers at her uncle's restaurant, in the way she understood things that people arranged into shapes and expected her not to see the structure beneath. She understood it, and it should have made her stand up, put on her coat, and take the elevator down. 6 months, she said. 6 months. Contract only. I want everything in writing. Something moved in his expression, very small. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. You want a written contract with a man who just told you he operates in an industry where being wrong has non-administrative consequences. If the contract's in writing, at least there's a record of what we agreed to. She met his eyes. And I'll want a copy. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, Miss Callahan." She nodded. She closed the last folder. She gathered her things. At the door, one of the large, quiet men stepped aside without being told to. She walked through without looking back, and she did not let herself feel the way the floor seemed slightly less solid under her feet than it had 3 hours ago, or the way the elevator seemed to take longer than usual to arrive, or the way her reflection in the elevator doors looked like someone who had just made a decision that could not be undone. She looked at her reflection and she thought, 6 months. Then she thought, I need to find what's there. His office was on the 31st floor of a building in Midtown that had no name on it, only a number. The lobby had 2 security desks, and a woman at the front who greeted Nora with the kind of pleasant professional neutrality that exists on only one side of a significant amount of money. Nora had grown up on the other side of that money. She knew how to recognize the border. She reported to Vance's office at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning, carrying a canvas tote bag and wearing the good blazer she'd bought at a consignment shop in Astoria 3 years ago that she'd been saving for occasions that required looking like she belonged somewhere she didn't. The PA, a man named Theo, efficient, young, carrying a tablet, walked her through 3 secured doors and deposited her in a room with no windows and a table covered in documents. "Mr. Vance will be available at 10, Theo said. "These are the initial review materials." Nora looked at the table. "What am I looking for?" He said you'd know. She sat down and she started to look. What she found, over the next 6 weeks, was this. Vance was building something. She couldn't see the whole shape of it from where she sat, which she suspected was intentional. He showed her one piece at a time, the way you show a locksmith a single lock and don't hand her the keys to the house. But the pieces were telling. A property acquisition in Newark that looked, on the surface, like commercial real estate, but whose tenant list, when she traced the corporate entities back 4 layers, resolved into a set of businesses that moved cash in predictable rhythms. A logistics company in New Jersey with a subsidiary in Wilmington that existed primarily, as far as she could tell, to hold a bank account that received wire transfers on the 14th of every month. A holding company with 11 sub-entities, 3 of which had the same registered agent as each other, and as a law firm in Lower Manhattan that she recognized from a news story she'd read 2 years ago and mostly forgotten. She didn't ask questions. She noted what she found, cross-referenced what she could, and put the discrepancies in a separate column clearly labeled Outstanding, Unresolved. At the end of the 3rd week, Vance looked at her outstanding column and said, "Most people would have asked. Asking closes doors," she said. "Looking leaves them open." He looked at her for a moment. "You grew up poor. That's not a question." "No," he agreed. "My mother cleaned offices in Midtown for 22 years, Nora said. She retired with a bad hip and a pension that paid out $800 a month. I know how these buildings work from the inside. I know what the cleaning crews see that nobody else sees." She paused. "People who grew up with money assume the interesting things happen in the boardroom. They don't." Vance said nothing for a moment. Then, the logistic subsidiary in New Jersey. The 14th of the month transfers average out to just under the federal reporting threshold. "Yes, that's not an accident." "No," he said, "it isn't." She looked at him across the table. He looked back. The scar along his jaw caught the light from the window, and she thought, not for the first time, that she would like to know the story of it, and that she would not ask. "Mr. Vance, I want to understand what I'm working with. You understand it already. I want to hear you say it." He was quiet. The building made its building sounds around them. The distant percussion of elevators, the hum of the HVAC, something far away that might have been traffic and might have been something else. Then he said, "The Vance organization operates in areas that are not fully legible to regulatory bodies. We manage assets, relationships, and certain categories of problem that conventional institutions cannot or will not address. The numbers you're reviewing are real. The flows are real. The paperwork in most cases is legally structured. In some cases, it is structured to appear legal. You are being paid to tell me the difference. Nora absorbed this. And the men at the door, she said. The midnight meeting. The building with no name, precautions. For what? For the fact that the people we do business with are not always the kind of people who file grievances in court. She picked up her pen. She put it back down. She thought about her mother's bad hip and the 42 floors, and the number that had been wrong, that had been sitting there waiting, that no one else had been patient enough to see. I need the full structure of the New Jersey entity, she said. Not just what's registered, the actual flow. He slid a folder across the table. She opened. The problem arrived in month 4 on a Tuesday in the form of a man named Harkin. She didn't learn his last name because he didn't offer it, and because by the time she understood what he was, last names felt less relevant than exits. He came into the windowed room at 11 in the morning. She'd graduated from the windowless room by then, which she suspected was its own kind of signal. And he sat down across from her, and he smiled the kind of smile that functions as a statement of ownership. He was maybe 50, with a politician's face and a property developer's hands, and he said, "You're the new girl." "I'm the analyst," Nora said. "Sure." He leaned back. He looked at the folders on her desk in a way that was designed to make her feel as though they were his. "Vance has had a few of you. Girls who can do sums, they tend to not last." Nora put her pen down. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Harkin?" He smiled. "I have a project coming through next quarter, development deal. Vance is a silent partner. I'll need someone to sign off on the figures before they go to the attorneys." "You'll need to schedule that through Theo." "I'm scheduling it through you." Directly. She looked at him. She thought about the structure beneath the structure, the thing she'd learned to see in 6 weeks of folders, the way the interesting things happen not in the boardrooms, but in the places nobody's watching. She thought about the fact that Harkin had not mentioned this project to her through any formal channel, had come to her directly instead of through Vance, and had sat down with the comfort of a man who assumed the furniture would hold him. "Mr. Harkin," she said, "my work is reviewed by Vance. If you have a project that involves this office, it needs to go through him. Vance is in Geneva this week, then it waits." The smile didn't move, but something behind it did. "You know what I like about the kind of girl Vance hires? You think the rules here work like rules out there." He gestured loosely at the window, at everything outside it. "They don't. Out there, you have rights, procedures, people who check up on things. In here, Nora said, the numbers have to be right. Where being wrong is not an administrative inconvenience." She said it back to him in Vance's exact words, the ones he'd used the night she met him, and she watched something shift in Harkin's expression. "And I'm telling you, Mr. Harkin, that if you'd like me to look at your development figures, you'll bring them to me through Theo, with Vance's authorization, when Vance is back from Geneva." She picked up her pen. "I'll be here." Harkin stood up. The smile was gone. "You're going to want to think carefully about how you play this." "I've thought about it," she said. "I'm still sitting here." He left. She set her pen down on the desk and looked at her hands until they were steady, because they had not been steady while he was in the room, though she was fairly certain he hadn't seen it. Then she picked the pen back up and went back to work. Vance came back from Geneva on a Thursday. He called her into the main office at 9 in the morning, and he stood at the window with his back to her and his hands behind him, which was how she'd learned he stood when he was thinking, and did not want the fact of his thinking to be visible on his face. "Harkin," he said. "Yes, he came to you directly, yes. What did he want?" She told him. She told him precisely, including the exact words, because in her experience the exact words were always the thing that mattered, the place where the variance lived, the number that told you whether someone had made an error or made a choice. When she finished, Vance was quiet for a long moment. "He said they don't last," Vance said. "He did the women I've hired, yes." Vance turned from the window. She'd learned to read his face in the way you learn to read weather, not by identifying expressions so much as by noticing the absence of them, the places where something had been removed. Right now his face was doing the thing it did when he had finished a calculation, and the answer had confirmed something he had already suspected. Mrs. Callahan. He walked to the desk. He didn't sit. He stood on the other side of it, which put 4 feet of mahogany between them, which was a distance she had come to understand as his minimum. Harkin is a partner in 3 of our real estate projects and a liability in all of them. I have known this for some time. I have been looking for the nature of the liability. She looked up at him. The development deal he wanted me to sign off on. Yes. He didn't want me to review it, she said slowly. He wanted me to sign off on it. There's a difference. There is. She thought about the figures she hadn't seen in the folder he hadn't brought for the project that was supposed to come through next quarter. She thought about someone with a politician's face and a property developer's hands, and a smile that expected the furniture to hold him. He was going to bring me numbers that were wrong, she said, and he expected me to put my name on them. He expected you to be willing to put your name on them for the right incentive. What incentive did he think would work? Vance looked at her steadily. In his experience, the incentive that works with people in your position is fear, or money, or the understanding that the organization's protection is conditional. And in your experience, something moved in his face. That small thing, the thing that was adjacent to something. In my experience, he said, people who look for what's there tend to have already decided what they're willing to see. She sat with that for a moment. I want to see his figures, she said. Vance nodded. He went to his desk and opened a drawer and took out a folder that was already there, already waiting, the way things were sometimes waiting when you were finally patient enough to arrive. I had Theo pull them this morning, he said, and slid it across. She opened it. The error was in the 3rd column. Not buried deep, not elegant. Sloppy, actually the kind of mistake that a careless person makes and a careful person notices in the first 2 minutes. But it wasn't the error she was looking for. She kept reading, turned the page, turned another. There, revenue projections for a mixed-use development in the Bronx, backed in part by capital from 3 shell entities, she recognized. She recognized them because she had spent 4 months tracing the structure of the Vance organization, and she had very good pattern recognition, and she knew these 3 companies did not invest in mixed-use Bronx developments. They moved cash in cycles. They existed for a different purpose, and someone had directed their capital here without authorization, which meant someone was using Vance's money without Vance's knowledge, which meant the error wasn't an error at all. She looked up. He's been skimming, she said. Vance said nothing. Not a small amount. She looked back at the page. He's running his development projections high, taking the overage off the top before the project accounts are reconciled, and he's routing it through your shell entities so that the outflow looks like ordinary operational spending. She paused. It's been going on for. She flipped back, checked her memory against the cash flow charts she'd reviewed 2 months ago. At least 18 months. Possibly longer. The office was very quiet. How much? Vance said. I'd need the full records. But from this alone, rough estimate. She did the math in her head, running the numbers without a calculator the way she'd learned when she was 9, and her mother needed the grocery receipt reconciled before her shift started, somewhere between 2 and 3 million. Vance stood very still. She thought about the men at the door on the night she'd met him. She thought about what he'd said, about the kinds of problems that conventional institutions could not or would not address, about non-administrative consequences. She thought about the fact that she was still sitting there. What happens to him? She said. Vance looked at her. That's not your department. No, she agreed. I just wanted to be clear about what I was handing you. You're handing me documentation. I'm handing you proof. He picked up the folder. He held it for a moment with the kind of weight that wasn't about the paper. Then he said, Mrs. Callahan, yes. Your 6 months ends in 8 weeks. She kept her voice even. I'm aware. I'd like to extend the contract. She looked at him across the desk, across the 4 feet of mahogany that was his minimum distance, across the 3 months and the folders and the windowless room, and the windowed room and the man with the politician's smile, and the number in the 3rd column that she'd found in 2 minutes. "For how long?" she said. "That would depend on what we agree to." "I want the full structure," she said. "Not one piece at a time. If I'm going to do this work correctly, I need to see the whole thing." He considered this. The scar along his jaw caught the light. Outside, far below, something was happening in the city, the way something was always happening in the city, indifferent and enormous. "That's not a small ask," he said. "I know. Knowing the full structure makes you," he paused, "a different kind of asset. I know that too." The word sat between them on the desk like another document to be reviewed. She did not flinch from it. She had done other people's numbers her whole life, and she had learned, early, that the numbers that mattered were the ones people tried to hide, and the way to find them was to look at everything, to not decide in advance what you were willing to see. "You understand," he said slowly, "what it means. To know the full structure. It means I can't unknow it," she said. "Yes. It means the organization's relationship to you changes. I understand." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She was not afraid, exactly. She was something more precise than afraid. She was aware, the way she was always aware, of the number that was really there versus the number that someone wanted her to see. The number that was really there was this. She was good at this. She was the best at this, possibly, that she had ever encountered. And she had encountered people with degrees from schools she hadn't been able to apply to, and resources she hadn't been able to imagine, and none of them had found the $47,000, and none of them had found Harkin in 4 months, and she had found both of those things in the time it took most people to finish a cup of coffee. The other number was this: she was sitting in a room on the 31st floor of a building with no name, and the man across from her ran the kind of organization where the consequences of being wrong were not administrative, and she had just handed him proof of someone's theft, and she was about to ask him to show her everything. Both numbers were true. Both numbers were what was there. She had never once looked away from a number just because it frightened her. "All right, Mr. Vance," she said. "Show me what you have." He opened the desk drawer again. This time, what he placed on the table was not a single folder. It was a key, small, steel, ordinary-looking. He set it down between them. "There's a room on the 29th floor," he said. "Everything is in there." She looked at the key. She looked at him. She thought about her mother and the grocery receipts and the 2 years of night classes and the dry cleaner that paid her under the table. And she thought about the $47,000 that had been sitting on a page for 4 months just waiting for someone patient enough to find it. She picked up the key. Outside, New York went on being New York, indifferent, enormous, lit up like an argument. Nobody was winning. But in the quiet of the 31st floor, in the space between what was documented and what was true, something had just been decided. Something that she understood would not be undone. She put the key in her pocket. She stood up. She was already thinking about the room on the 29th floor, about the shape of what she would find there, about what it meant to finally see the structure whole. The numbers were waiting. She had always been good at finding them.